Thank you for being here. I'm excited about what God has in store with us in the next few minutes here together. I want to talk about something that I know you were dying to hear about. I want to talk about blinders. The first image that should come to you when you think about the word blinders or what blinders are should be what? Horse races. Horse racing, horses. So blinders, if you're unfamiliar, are what they put on the side of horses' face, and they keep them focused on what's in front of them and away from what's on the sides of them. Now, I think that I'm not talking specifically about horse blinders today, but I'm talking about blinders that we bring into every situation that we exist in. Because whether or not we realize it, we function with a set of blinders in everything we do. And so I think we're working on some computer issues, but I have a video to hopefully open up that idea of blinders a little bit more this morning.
My sister and her family have lived in New York for like 8 years now. She took care of me when I was a little kid because my parents were working.
Every Sunday I cook, and so my uncle calls me, and he'll be like, hey, what you making?
Nobody meets in bars anymore, but I met my wife in a bar, and 34 years later, still working.
My grandma had a lot of costumes from the theater that she started. When we were kids, we'd dress up in those costumes and we'd put on little sketches for the family.
In my whole life, I've always felt like we were like a team, my brother and I. I think there's nobody who can understand you quite like your family.
That's my cousin.
That's really weird.
She ain't even look.
I know she's not homeless because I just hung out with her a couple weeks ago, but I mean, I did not know that person when I was walking by, it was her.
It's, and things are a lot more real than you expect, so.
So that video is eye-opening and can be seen as embarrassing for those involved. But I think what it does better is it gives us an idea of what we actually do and how we exist in the world. Now, before you get offended, I'm not preaching as if you should take down the blinders on your eyes. I'm preaching as if I need to move out of this place and take the blinders down from my own eyes. Because there's the way that we view the world where things on the peripheral have no bearing in our lives. And even family members in need become invisible because all we can see is where we're going. And so I want to talk a little bit about the blinders that we deal with in our lives and how the story of the Good Samaritan is leading us into a new way of living. So what are the blinders we deal with? What would cause us to look the other way? I think there are tons of them in our lives. I think one is fear. Sometimes fear motivates us to keep our eyes forward and not worry about what happens on the side. Because what would happen if I were to stop and help? Maybe this guy's dangerous. He looks different than me. He acts different than me. So maybe it's fear. Maybe it's bigotry or racism. And I say that as a reminder that even though we all are becoming sanctified more and more to the image of Jesus, we all have part of us that's still a reality in us. And so maybe it's bigotry or racism. Maybe it's hate. Something at some point created in you this hate for a type of people or a certain person, and so our blinders keep us forward. Maybe it's the most dangerous, which is apathy. We just don't care. We just don't care, and so apathy continues to push us forward without paying attention to what's around us. Maybe we're just unaware. Maybe we just didn't know that this was an issue. Maybe we didn't see the person on the side of the road because we just weren't aware that there are issues such as homelessness or brokenness around us. Maybe it's elitism. Maybe because of where we are in our socioeconomic standing, we don't pay attention to those who are maybe in a different place than we are. Maybe it's geography. I think this is one that is a reality for us in specific, is being a church that's planted in Edmond. We exist in Edmond. When I started in student ministry here at New Covenant, I started having conversations with kids, and in conversations I would start mentioning places that were familiar to me. I wasn't from Edmond. I lived in Edmond for like a semester when I was in college. Other than that, I wasn't around, and so I started mentioning all the places that are familiar to me, and I realized that if it was south of Memorial, pretty much no kid knew it existed. It's like, yeah, the Old Navy on Memorial and Penn. They're like, you're talking about the Old Navy on Danforth and Bryant, because surely that's the only, or the second Bryant, because surely that's the only one that's there, right? Like, there's no place that exists south of Memorial. And so what happens for us, and this is just this is not a condemnation on us. I'm not saying that we're all in trouble and you need to repent. Like, there is part of that in this, but I'm saying there's a reality that you live in a place and you do most of your business in life in a place. And it becomes this bubble that you exist in. So sometimes geography is actually detrimental to our engagement to love the neighbors around us. Because we spend the time in our neighborhoods, the grocery stores that are around us, with the people that are around us, at the church that's around us. And so sometimes when we do that, it's a blinder that doesn't pay attention to the needs that are around our world. And then the last one is I think we can figure out enough excuses in our lives to not have to deal with what's going on in our world. Excuses were very, very real to the story of the Good Samaritan. See, in a modern day telling, which we'll walk through here in a little bit, there's three different people that engage him. And the first two, the priest and the Levite, both had legitimate excuses as to why they shouldn't engage with this man who had been beaten and robbed. Because they were both of the temple order, right? So they're both, if they engage with this man, they would become ritually unclean. So it'd be this whole big deal. If they were going to become clean again, they would have to go through this whole process and be in front of people and fast and do all these things for multiple days. And so, man, I could engage with this guy, but it'd really be a hassle if I did. So we're kind of second week in, and we're going through a series called Cultivate. And it's going to turn into our stewardship series here in a couple weeks. And what AC kind of decided we would do is that we're going to go through a parable a week. And here's the hard thing about parables is they're huge in their significance, they're huge in their implications, and you could take each one of these parables and walk through 4 or 5 specific truths that God wants to tell you today. And so today what I want to do is I want to take this story, who most of you have heard numerous times, and make it something new or refreshing and challenging for you today. And so in order to do that, we need to talk about the story itself. And so Jesus is doing what Jesus does. He's around people, and a teacher of the law comes up trying to trick him, trying to test him. Jesus, how do I get to eternity? How do I get eternal life? Well, what do you think? I love doing my own Jesusism, so if it offends you that I'm, defaming Jesus or something, Jesus is like, hey, what's your thoughts? What do you want? Well, love God and love the neighbors. That's good. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the guy wasn't content with that because it didn't trick Jesus enough. So, okay, well, who's my neighbor? And then he begins to tell this story, and the first one he talks about as a priest. This is why I want to give you some space. I worked through this with a good friend of mine, and I want to create some space for you to think an imaginative way about this story. So a priest, think about who would be a modern-day priest. Someone who is supposed to be a religious leader or leaders who you actually see or assume is corrupt or self-serving. Someone that is a religious leader, but you have an assumption that there's something going on. They're a little sleazy, they're a little tricky, because that's how they were seen in the time of Jesus' life. So who would that be? Don't say Methodist pastors. But it could be, right? Like a pastor of some sort. This is really fun for me because it's like, this is who I am in the story. I'm the guy that walks around the side. There's an assumption of pastors that sometimes they're out for themselves, they're out for glory, they're out for money, whatever it is. And one of the examples I heard is a Baptist minister, and so we'll rest in that one. That'll be a good one that we can deal with today. The second one is a Levite, who is someone you see as faithful, doing the work of ministry in the temple, right? So people who are faithful, who are doing the work of ministry. So who do you see as that? Sunday school teachers, right? The prayer warriors, the people that are here to set up communion in the corners or to make this place look beautiful. They go to Wednesday nights, they go to Sunday mornings, they go to 2 or 3 services on Sunday mornings, they go to Sunday school, they lead a Bible study. They're the righteous. They're the people that everybody looks up to. Man, if I could only be like that person, Jesus would love me more. And then you have the Samaritan, someone you would see negatively as a heretic, an outcast, someone to be feared, or who would lower your social capital from the perspective of others. I asked this question in the first service, and I asked it really not caring what the answer was, but how offensive do you want me to be this morning? Good, I'll be very offensive. So here's another modern day telling of it. A Baptist preacher passes by this man, a church prayer warrior passes by this man, but the Muslim, a person that we believe has something they believe that is false, and they're seen as potentially dangerous, and there's an unclean feel about associating with them too much, stops and shows radical love and care to the man in need. That may function well for us today. That story, as that may have shocked you, shocked everybody when Jesus said it. Because the Samaritans were despised. They were hated. They intermarried and interbred with a different people, a captive people. And so when Jesus shared that story, he knew that it would shock them. And it should shock you as well. And it shocked the man so much that at the end, when Jesus asked him, well, which one of these loved their neighbor? He says, the man who cared for him. He doesn't even use the name Samaritan. See, I think it's easy for us to get shocked by this story, but what it should do is challenge us to a new life, a new way of living, and a new way of engaging with people outside of the blinders we have up. So, where I want to go, and where we're going for the rest of this sermon, is how Jesus ends it. After he tells this story and he asks who the neighbor is, and the teacher of the law responds, and he says, what? Go and do likewise. Go and do. Go and do something. In response to the story, go and do something. So how do we, as a church and as a people united underneath the call of Jesus on our lives, become a people who go and do stuff? And obedience to that call means that we have to move into a new way of living. And I've got some points in your bulletins if you want to follow along. You may be thinking, oh gosh, he's already 10 minutes in and he hasn't even got to his points. They'll go quickly. So obedience to the call that Jesus has on our lives means that first and foremost, we have to move from ignoring to engaging. We have to move from ignoring the problems in our world, from ignoring the reality of the life that people live in, into engaging. And I think there's a really easy way for us to do this. Listen. Listen. How many of you have ears? Right? Everybody has ears. Yay. Right? And we watched that video last week, and AC talked about the parable of the sower, and I think that has incredible implications because the simplest act you can do to move from ignoring to engaging the problems in our world, the areas that Jesus is calling us to be actively engaged in, is to open your ears and listen to the needs around you. What are the needs around you? You won't know until you ask people and you respond by listening to them, and really listening, not hearing. Every time he was talking about that last week, I just thought about my son. Like every time I'm like, Andrew, are you listening to me? Yes. Are you actually hearing me though? No is always the answer to that. And so we as people of God, people called to a new way of living, people that are called to love our neighbors as ourselves must move from ignoring the issues to engaging the issues. The second one is from standing by to kneeling down. The Levite and the priest, they have a posture in which they pursue the man. They're walking down the street. It's a fairly popular road. It's a dangerous road, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. And as they're walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, they have an option, right? They don't have the excuse of ignoring it. They see it. It's right there. So they have an option. So they decide to stand to the side and move by around it. And the Samaritan, the man who did what Jesus was looking for us to do, walks by and kneels down. Now, there's a ton of opportunity for dangerous things to happen there, right? If it is something that maybe this is a past that had a really negative belief about it. There were robberies that happened all the time, and Jesus told the story out of that context. And so the man that stood down, there's a fear and there's a reality of fear that if I do something, something may happen to me. But the posture that he takes is not standing by or walking around, but kneeling down with him. So I think the second thing we need to realize is that Jesus is calling us to get our hands dirty. He is calling us to a life that is actively engaged in the needs of people. And this is the hard thing for me, because this is a hard thing for all of us probably. Is we're really good at giving money to fix problems. Right? I'll write a check, man. Yeah, they need some help over there. You know, there's poor people that need food down there, and so I'm going to write a check to the regional food bank. Great, incredibly important. Regional food bank functions out of your money, donations, all those things. Skyline, Exodus House. Yeah, Exodus House doing a great thing. I can give them a couch, and I can go and paint a room for a little while. Those are great things. But what this means, and what the Samaritan story means, is that it goes beyond that. Because the thing that's important as part of this is that the Samaritan story doesn't stop at, I bandaged, I helped him up, and I sent him on his way. And that leads us to our third point, which is obedience to God's call in our life leads us from walking by to standing with. From walking by to standing with. Engaging in the world in the way that Jesus calls us to is a call towards a lifelong commitment to doing so. This is not a momentary engagement in one issue for one moment. The Samaritan takes the man to the inn. He says, take care of this man. I bandaged him up. He's in decent shape now, but take care of him. Get him well, and whatever happens, I will pay you back for what you have to do to take care of him. This man realized that helping somebody is not lifting them up once and moving on to the next person. What the world needs is Jesus. What the world needs is Jesus. And they don't need Jesus just in glimpses where we just show up and here's some Jesus and then move on to the next story. They need Jesus that says, here's Jesus, and I'm going to stand with you in the midst of whatever you're going through to show you that Jesus is real in my life and wants to transform yours. There's longevity, there's investment that comes by becoming like the Samaritan. And investment is hard because, like I said, our easiest investment, the one that makes the most sense, is money. But it's more than that. It's time, it's love, it's effort, it's a little skin in the game, and it's a lot of risk. Because I can go around here and tell you about 30 stories that I know exist in this congregation of people who have done that and have stood next to people, whether in their family, outside of their family, people they've met, engaged with, and they've stood with them, and they've invested in them, they've discipled them, they've showed them Jesus, and in return, they got nothing. They got something stolen from them. They got their heart broken. They went back down the path to addiction. So it takes risk. Because there's a reality that as you do these things, you become more like Jesus. And did anybody live a riskier life than Jesus? Did y'all know he wasn't killed just because that's what the Bible was supposed to do? Like, it wasn't just like, well, the Bible says so, let me get on this cross. Like, he was killed because he lived a life of radical love, of radical caring, of radical risk. And his response to the followers of Jesus is, if anybody wants to follow me, buckle up. If anybody wants to follow me, you got to pick up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me daily. And so inherent in who we are as followers of Christ is risk. One of the dangerous things for us is when we start to become more interested in ourselves as a church than we do as the world as the church. It's something that's detrimental to the church. And last week we had Charge Conference here, and I don't know how many of you went. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because it'll just be sad. But the Charge Conference was one of those things that normally it's like just kind of a business meeting and you walk through some things, but the conference is shifting some stuff. And we got together and we dreamed about what the church is going to look like and shape into for the future. We started looking at the reality that the Methodist Church is dying across the board. We're doing okay. Don't hear me saying that. Like, this is not time to jump out of the boat. But the Methodist Church is struggling. And one of the statistics that's glaring is out of the millennial generation, which I am a part of, which I understand is the worst generation of all time. I get that. I love it. I'm a part of it. Maybe I'm the worst, and that's okay. Just don't tell me that. But the millennial generation is leaving the church in unbelievable amounts. They say 1 out of every 3 not only doesn't go to church, but they consider themselves to have no religious affiliation, no belief. And I believe there's a reason behind that. I think the reason is because they've stopped seeing the church as an entity that makes a difference in the world. What happens is the millennials, they love to see things that make a difference. That's why we all have liberal arts degrees, right? That's why every time what do you want to do with your life? I don't know, I just can't be in a cubicle. Well, like, good luck with that. We only have so many pastoral positions open. That was a joke. Never mind. Thank you, Nathan. But they want to see something that's making a difference. And if I can just speak one thing to you, there should be nothing on earth that is making a bigger impact in the world than the church. And so when millennials should be looking for things that make a difference, they should see a shining example of making a difference in the world in the church in every single neighborhood, every single city, every single country and state that we are a part of. Right? Because as soon as we become more interested with the outside, we become rejuvenated in ourselves. We are not a club, and I'm sorry if we've confused you. We aren't a country club. We don't have a pool. Maybe we should. We do. We do have a jacuzzi. It's called a baptismal font. It's behind that. We're not a club, we're a church. We are sent on mission into the world. See, there's a mistake that was made, and it was a mistake that was honest. I don't think it was bad. He still believes this. There's a pastor out of Chicago who said that the church is the hope of the world. There's part of that that's true. But what happens when that's your model is the church becomes an end to itself, not a means to an end. And when the church becomes the end goal, when attendance is more important than engaging in the world, we will decay from the inside, and you will have a bunch of empty buildings that have become office buildings that used to be churches. Jesus Christ is the hope of the world, and for some crazy reason, he chose a bunch of fools like us in the church to be his hands and feet in the world. And so we take that somewhere. We went a couple weeks ago. Oh my gosh, it's 12. We went a couple weeks ago. Dang it. We went a couple weeks ago to this bishop's retreat here locally, and all the pastors of the Methodist Church got together, and this guy named Reggie McNeil spoke. And he's just a terrible person to have because he's going to not let you leave the same. And one of the things he talked about is he talked about the millennial thing, and he said one of the things that needs to change is we need to stop being so church-centric and we need to become kingdom-centric. And then our DS came up and he kind of opened that up a little bit more, and he asked this question. This is what I want to ask you before we close. What is your community? Who is your community? Who is your neighbor? Which the answer for us is everybody. Everybody's our neighbor, but we do have actual neighbors around us. Everybody here has a house or an apartment or a place they live, and in that place there are actual people that live there. I'm not sure if that's a surprise to you, but they do exist. And he said, so who are your neighbors? And then he asked these two questions. He said, what is your community's heart broken for? What are the needs in your community? What do you see in the lives and hearts of people where Jesus needs to enter into their worlds? Which the first thing I had to respond is like, oh, I don't know. I'm so sorry, I have no idea. Which was humbling and defeating, but challenging to lead me to a new place to figure out what our heart breaks for in the neighborhood around us and the world around us. But the second thing he said, what does your heart's church burst for? What is your heart's church, or what is your church's heart burst for? Which is you. What are you so passionate about in the world that every time you hear a story about it on the news, you're brought to tears? Is it addiction? Is it education? Is it war? Is it sex trafficking? Is it poverty? Is it homelessness? Is it people who don't have food? Is it children who don't have opportunities to be successful? What is your heart bursting for? Because here's where I am today. Is I'm in a place where I'm ready to start saying yes. You figure out what your heart's bursting for, and we're going to figure out ways to let you explode all over this community. Now I have so much more left, but I'm going to if you want to have a personal sermon, just call me up and get together at somebody's house. I'll finish this sermon. So two things. There's a story that's become almost mythical out of World War II, and it's a German town that existed kind of in the height of the Holocaust and everything, and there was a train that would come by their church, and every Sunday morning they'd be sitting in church like this, and they'd hear the whistle of the train as the train rolled in, and the loud, we are familiar with that in Edmond. But beyond the normal sounds of a train, what they would hear is they would hear the screams and cries of a bunch of people because this train wasn't carrying stuff. It was carrying Jews and others who were deemed unworthy of life, who were on a train headed to be executed at the local concentration camp. And so the church heard these noises every Sunday morning, and they were just overcome, but not overcome in the way that they should have been. They were overcome because it started interrupting their worship service. So they made a decision as a church. Every Sunday morning this happens at the same time, and so here's what we're going to do. At this exact moment, we're going to start singing a song, and if we start hearing things, we're going to start singing louder, and if we keep hearing things, we're going to sing louder and louder until we sing the song so well that we don't hear what's going on outside. May God destroy the church as it is, if that's the posture that we engage the world in. May God break our hearts if we become so centric to what goes on here and how the pew fits, and am I comfortable? Is the music loud enough? Is it too loud? Is it quiet? Do the lights look good? How does the video, or how do we make sure that we feed people? May we be broken if we're more focused. All of those things are great and important, but if we are focused, centric on that and not on the world around us and the needs in the world around us, then I hope God shatters our hearts today. Martin Luther King, this is what I will close with. Martin Luther King, in his last speech he ever gave in Memphis, he gave a speech, and it's the mountaintop speech if you've ever heard it. And he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he's talking about the road from Jericho, or from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he said, that's a dangerous road. In the days of Jesus, it came to be known as the bloody pass. It's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over to that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt the man on the ground was merely faking it, as he was acting like he had been robbed or hurt in order to seize them and lure them in for a quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked and the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? And then he says this, but then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. He said, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? So the Good Samaritan is a story about changing the lens in which we view the world. It's a story about reminding us that everybody is our neighbor. Anybody in need is a neighbor in need of a Samaritan, to love them, to engage with them, to disciple them, to care for them, to invest in them, to pick them up, to stand with them, and to walk through a new way of living with them together. And so our function in the midst of this is a response. So we got to ask the question, how do we function? Do we function out of a view of life that says, what will happen to me if I stoop down and help? Versus the way that God is calling us to say, what will happen to them if we don't do something? So that's the question I leave with you today. We're going to